Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good evening to our viewers. Welcome to Urgent Spotlight. My name is Azrul Khalib. This is a series of online talk shows where we will be covering how the various policies and actions implemented during this period have impacted today's urgent issues related to women, workers' welfare, the urban poor, refugees, education, indigenous people, migrants, and of course, healthcare. The agenda for Urgent Spotlight is policy reform and holding the government, policy and decision makers accountable. We are broadcasting live every Tuesday and Thursday at 8:30 p.m. via the CSO Platform for Reform's Facebook page. Tonight's speaker wrote an op-ed in The Star last year on the first anniversary of the Pakatan Harapan victory in Malaysia's 14th general elections, criticizing the government at the time of being less than enthusiastic about introducing reforms to a government business institutional framework that contributed to extensive corruption, debilitating patronage, even the birth of a kleptocracy. UMNO's defeat in those elections was largely attributed to the abuse of 1MDB, Felda, and Tabung Haji, institutions known as government-linked companies or GLCs, which raised public expectations that such government business networks would be reformed. However, the process of consolidating power by the ruling coalition at the time hampered GLC reform and arguably perpetuated the politics of patronage and race-based policies and politics. Today, 1 year later, and a new government now in power, GLCs have again become a source of attention and contention, with members of the Perikatan Nasional allegedly demanding and being given directorships and key leadership positions in a number of companies, perhaps as a reward for their political support and guaranteeing long-term support for the current administration. But does this issue resonate with the Rakyat? Are they concerned, and should they be? When bread and butter issues become even more critical for Makcik Kia or Madam Lee, as heads of their households, does it matter who becomes the boss of a GLC? To help answer these questions and make more sense of what is happening today on this particular issue, we have with us this evening Professor Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez. Prof. Terence Gomez is a professor of political economy at the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya. He specializes in state market relations and the linkages between politics, policies, and capital development. He served as research coordinator at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva, where he conducted pioneering global research on racial conflict. He has held appointments at universities in several countries, including Japan, UK, United States, and Australia. He is the author of Minister of Finance Incorporated, which discusses today's subject at length as part of an ongoing research which he is currently conducting. The book can be found in quality bookshops around Malaysia. A little bit of promotion for you, Professor. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Azrul. I'm happy to be here today.
We're delighted to have you, Professor. To kickstart tonight's session, we have a short video on this particular topic.
How many GLCs are there in Malaysia? Is CIMB a GLC? What about Astro? Time Darby? What do we even consider as GLC? Government-linked company are companies directly and indirectly owned by the government. Towards that ideas, as a rule of thumb, government should be a majority shareholder or single largest shareholder, thus having the power to make decisions in the company for it to qualify as GLC. So, these are companies such as Telekom Malaysia, Maybank, Petronas, Pharmaniaga, and Malaysia Airlines. Government-linked investment company invests on behalf of the government and the public. Known as the Seven Sisters, each one has their own mandates. Minister of Finance Incorporated is a holding company for Ministry of Finance. Khazanah is Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund. Khazanah has two objectives. First, they grow financial assets and diversify revenue sources for the country. Secondly, they hold assets that bring long-term economic benefits. They both invest on behalf of the government. Kumpulan Wang Simpanan Pekerja, Lembaga Tabung Haji, Lembaga Tabung Angkatan Tentera, Kumpulan Wang Persaraan, and Permodalan Nasional Berhad. All of these invest on behalf of the people. Now, let's look at ways a company can be considered a GLC. GLCs can be companies owned by GLICs. A GLC can also be indirectly owned by the GLIC. Some GLCs are owned by a few GLICs. There are also GLCs that are not owned by a GLIC. It's confusing, right? To put it simply, consider it as a family tree, and if its lineage traces back to the government, it can be considered a GLC. And
if you combine all of them together, they'll probably be one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world.
So how did GLC came about? I think we can all agree that there are some things that are essential for people. We could hope that the market would provide these things, but what do we do if they don't?
There are, often very good reasons for the state to intervene in the market, particularly when it comes to solving public policy issues or trying to achieve certain social objectives that are not currently being met.
And thus, GLCs are born to help these market failures. So, how many GLCs are there? 20, 30, 100? Actually, we don't know. The government has never announced a total number of GLCs in Malaysia. There are no widely agreed upon definition, but based on our research, following these criteria, there are 71 of them. However, it is likely that many have fallen under the radar. According to another research, GLC makes up more than 40% of the market value of all public listed companies in Malaysia. Although GLC came from a good place, we think that there are underlying issues that needs to be addressed. Join us in the next video as we explore the issues of GLC and the potential solution that the forum came up with.
Well, there you have it. In a short 3-minute video, a little bit of a description of what is considered GLC, who are the GLCs, and one of the things that's really startling in that short clip is the fact that we possibly don't know how many GLCs are there in Malaysia. And I think we'll go straight into it, Prof. How is it possible that we don't even know how many of these companies or entities are there? Does the government itself even know? What does your research tell us?
Well, first of all, let me say this. The video that you just showed only referred to publicly listed GLCs. There are many other different types of GLCs that includes statutory bodies, sovereign wealth funds, that includes foundations, the list goes on, holding companies too. But I'd like to start today by first talking about the context in which, how did these GLCs come about in the first place? For this, we have to go back in history, and the history that I like to go back to is the 1950s and 1960s. As pointed out in the video, GLCs were created to help people. They had a social good. Tabung Haji and Felda were created in the 1950s and 1960s. I'm focusing on Tabung Haji and Felda precisely because they were created to help poor people. Tabung Haji was to help poor people do the Hajj, while Felda was to try and take landless people, give them land, and make them a new landed middle class. Did Felda succeed? The Felda succeeded famously. It is world-renowned for its land redistribution success. As with regards to Tabung Haji, did many people get to go and do their Hajj? Yes. So the government has succeeded by creating these types of institutions to help rectify social problems in the country. But what happened also in the 1960s is this: in the immediate post-colonial period, Tun Abdul Razak at that time created what was known as the Ministry of Rural Development. And here the Ministry of Rural Development was primarily to focus on the rural poor. At that time, Malaysia was an extremely poor country. More than 60% of the population was poor, and they were situated in rural areas. And here we then have new institutions created like MARA and RISDA and FELCRA. They all targeted the poor. Were they successful? Yes. They were quite successful as in the sense that you can see the poverty rate in this country has now reduced appreciably. If it was in about 60% in the 1960s, today we are down to about 10%. The figures disputed, but it has no doubt, there's no doubt that the poverty rates have reduced enormously. Who do we attribute this to? Again, we go back to these so-called GLCs. Now here, the defining moment was the 1980s. In the 1980s, we had a Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, who changed the direction. He began to talk about corporatization, privatization. And then a new discourse emerged, create Malay capitalists, Melayu Baru, for example, corporate Melayu. These were new terms that were created. And the idea was to privatize many of these agencies and put them in private hands. In the 1990s, what we saw was the rise of politicians in business. UMNO became a party of businessmen. It was no longer a party of teachers. It was predominantly a party of businessmen who hoped to get into business by also joining the party. In fact, what happened was this led to the point that we're discussing today. How are GLCs linked to money politics? And as you know, by the 1990s, money politics became a huge problem in the country. And you can now link this all back to the GLCs and the corporatization and the privatization process that occurred. Now here, I just want to say this one point. It became such a big problem that Mahathir himself in the 1990s convened a special UMNO assembly to discuss, as he put it, this problem. UMNO had become too rich. He said it's a cancer, his words, a cancer that has permeated the body politic. And we have to do something about this before this cancer destroys the party. When Abdul Ahmad Badawi became Prime Minister, he said the same thing. So we can see here from this brief history, a political business system was created. It became entrenched in the politics of our country. And this has led to huge wastage of resources. And that's the problem that we are now grappling with.
Well, you mentioned quite a number of big names there just now. Tabu Haji, Felda, Mara. We also heard from the video, Sime Darby, Maybank, Farmaniaga, CIMB. And it's been indicated that they've dominated the market, being GLCs, they're public listed, they have like more than 40% of market value. But as you said yourself just now, is that they targeted the poor and underserved, and they delivered. And it's changed the landscape of where we are today compared to where we were back in the 70s. Isn't that the sign of success for the benefits of having the state have these GLCs and to be able to bring about quite a rapid pace of development that when you compare to other countries where you have a lot more higher rate of corruption, in Malaysia, we've managed to bring that development and have a certain amount of distribution of wealth with it. So, I mean, isn't that a sign of those GLCs being successful?
Let me be very clear. I am a great proponent of government intervention in the economy. I'm a great proponent of many aspects of the GLC system, provided it plays the developmental role that it was created to do. Now, if initially the focus was on its developmental role, what I'm saying is through the history we have seen that developmental role has now shifted into a political role, with politicians now capturing control of these very important institutions created to help the poor, but now hijacked by politicians to serve their own vested interests. That's where the transition occurred. Now, that's what we want to reform. Get the politicians out, get the GLCs back to what they were supposed to do, that is, play a social role in the economy, intervene to rectify social injustices, and intervene also to help industrialize the economy, go into areas where private sector does not venture into. That was the role of Khazanah, and they have done that well. Now, with regards to the video and your point that we have so many publicly listed firms which are GLCs, this is part of the corporatization movement, the privatization movement that I talked about. Now, the fact of the matter is these are not real privatization. Privatization means The government no longer is a shareholder. But if you look at the top 10 companies, they are called GLCs because the government still is a shareholder, in fact, a majority shareholder. So here is the problem. These are not real privatizations. These are companies in which the government still has a major interest in. Now, if these companies are well run without any corruption or abuse of these companies, then they can still play a very big role in the economy. Now, why are these companies among the top 10 companies, among the largest publicly listed companies in the country today? The reason for that is in 1997, we had a currency crisis. And when the currency crisis occurred, we realized that these are important companies and we have to utilize them well. In the early 2000s, there was a GLC transformation plan because they recognized if we do not use these companies well, the whole economy can collapse. And a GLC transformation plan occurred. And that is why today, when we talk about corruption and abuse, we don't really refer to these companies, because one of the major points that occurred in the GLC transformation plan was this: politicians should not serve as directors of these companies. And that was one of the major changes that occurred with the GLC transformation plan. So we can see here now from history what can happen if you get the politicians out of the board of directors.
Let me take you up on that point. What is wrong with having politicians or their appointees become directors or leaders of government-controlled business-based institutions such as the ones that you just mentioned, Tanpa Haji, Felda, Khazanah Nasional, when they are qualified? PKR President Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim himself made that distinction in a statement last July, and he said, I quote, "We also cannot assume that these politicians are corrupted, nor can we presume that they are not corrupted, as corruption happens everywhere, be it politicians or civil servants. So our aim really is to eradicate corruption," unquote. So how can those sort of appointments be described as money politics, or what you mentioned just now as a kind of cancer that's very much pervasive in today's political scene in Malaysia? How can these appointments be bad decisions?
Well, here I want to go back to the different types of GLCs that we have. Now, for publicly listed firms, we have seen we don't need to have politicians in these publicly listed corporations, which are major enterprises. And they are in finance, they are in telecommunications, they are in oil and gas. Do we need politicians to be sitting in these publicly listed firms? Secondly, who is monitoring these firms? We have the Securities Commission, we have the Bursa, they monitor these firms. They are constantly under the spotlight. Do we need politicians to sit there and monitor how these companies are being run? I don't think so. Where we do need politicians, I would argue, would be probably at the GLIC level, say at Khazanah, at PNB, where we do need politicians to have an oversight as to whether these companies also are abiding by public policies which were created by the government. So I'm not saying that all politicians should be out of all types of GLCs. I would say let's go through the GLC system and see where they are required. There they can go in. If it's a public policy, let's take, for example, Felda or Resda or Ketengah, even Mara. They were created to implement public policies. They were implemented to rectify social injustices. If politicians do sit there because they are directly under the government and they have to monitor the implementation of policies, I would say, fine, go ahead. I'm not opposed to it. But what I am saying is, let's also, when we make these appointments, be very clear. Are there checks and balances among the board of directors? Or is there a shift in the balance of power? Is now power shifted to the politicians who have major decision-making authority? For example, if the Prime Minister sits as the chairman of Khazanah, and all Prime Ministers in the recent past, wanted to be chairman of Khazanah because they control all these publicly listed companies that we just talked about, are there members of the board of Khazanah who will stand up to the Prime Minister and say to the Prime Minister, "I'm sorry, sir, we don't accept this"? The same thing at the state level. We have Chief Minister Incorporated. Do the members of the board of all the various public agencies stand up to the Chief Minister and tell him, "I'm sorry, this is not acceptable"? Now, therein lies the problem, the balance of power. the checks and balances. Those are the things that have been taken away. And that is why we are seeing this corruption occurring.
So in a corporate structure, there's always an element of checks and balances. Either it's from the board or it's shareholders. There's a certain amount of oversight that governs a corporate entity. So you're saying that when you have a politician at the top, or at least part of the decision-making process, that those checks and balances could be compromised. Is that what you're saying?
So here, Azrul, I want to make a distinction between companies. As we said, as we saw in the video, there are many types of GLCs. Some are companies, some are statutory bodies. Statutory bodies do not fall under the Companies Act. GLCs, if they are incorporated as a company, they fall under the Companies Act, which is quite broad and universal for all companies, regardless whether they're GLCs or not. Then we have statutory bodies. Statutory bodies are governed by a particular legislation. It's very specific to the statutory body. Now here, when we talk about GLCs, we're talking about corporate governance. And as far as corporate governance is concerned, a lot of reforms occurred, especially after 1997, after the currency crisis. A lot of corporate governance reforms occurred, which is why we don't see as much corruption among the publicly listed companies, which are GLCs. Where do we see a lot of corruption? Among the statutory bodies. Here, it's not an issue of corporate governance. It's an issue of public governance. Here, we are talking about public agencies. If you see today, most of the politicians want control of the statutory bodies. The statutory bodies don't have that kind of oversight that publicly listed companies are subjected to. And if you look at what is happening in statutory bodies, this is where you see the greatest volume of corruption. So, for example, where did we see a lot of corruption? Mara, Feldha, Tabung Haji.
Let me ask you about corruption, because we've mentioned that term several times now. And what are we talking about when we're talking about corruption here? Because the Rakyat, we want to see the Rakyat be concerned about corruption, but they do not see how it's linked back to themselves as the Rakyat. How does it even affect them? Because even until today, 1MDB is something of a head scratcher for the average person on the street, and they don't see how that affected us. And the term corruption is used again and again. Yet, what are we talking about? Was there conflict of interest? Was there taking of money? Was there self-enrichment? What are we talking about when we talk about corruption?
That's a very good point again, Azrul, because corruption is a wide term. Now, there's corruption legally defined. That means by law, if you do something wrong, we can charge you in court, for which we are now seeing many politicians being charged in court because they did something by law, which was illegal. So we have Najib and the cases against him. We have Tunku Adnan, where there was a clear case of corruption by law. We have also Zahid, who's now facing numerous charges, which by law they violated. Then there's another type of corruption, which I would like to call the abuse of power. Now, that is not legally defined. Now, what do I mean by abuse of power? When we talked about, for example, the creation of all these statutory bodies, they were created to implement a social policy. The social policy was created to help rectify social injustices, targeting primarily the disenfranchised. The concessions that were created were targeted for those people. But here we have politicians getting the position as directors of these statutory bodies, also called GLCs, and abusing that power to channel those same concessions to party members. Why can they do it? For example, we have the new economic policy or the Bumiputra policy. It's supposed to be meant for Bumiputras. Are the party members Bumiputras? Yes, they are. But are they the Bumiputras who were supposed to get it? No. It was supposed to go to poor Bumiputras. And instead, it's hijacked by politicians. Now, that's an abuse of power. But you cannot charge them in court because as far as they are concerned, they're implementing a public policy. They're implementing the Bumiputra policy. And that's a serious abuse of power. That's the first point. Concessions created for the poor are hijacked by politicians to serve their own party interests. The second point, These statutory bodies then go and create numerous GLCs, and that's why we have a proliferation of GLCs. Once they create the GLCs, what happens is they can appoint directors to these GLCs. These directors are politicians, and these politicians get a stipend as directors, and the stipend is huge. And that stipend not only goes to them, but it also is channeled into the party's coffers. So government funds then become a mechanism to channel money meant for the poor to the party for their party activities. This is the money politics that we are talking about that transpired. So this is the GLC system that is created, which is why politicians love it. If you get access to the GLCs, you can appoint your supporters as directors, and you can also use the GLCs to channel concessions to your supporters too. And that's where the real abuse is happening. We can't charge them in court for it because by law, they're not violating anything. In fact, they're implementing a public policy. But this is what we want to stop. That is why Mohideen today can go and appoint all these people as directors of the statutory bodies, and nobody is saying this is corruption. But we are saying
illegal, right? Yeah.
It's a serious abuse of power on his part. And why are they doing it? They did this to consolidate their power base. This is exactly what Mohideen is doing today. He's using the system to consolidate his power base. Is this abuse of power? Of course it is.
So, Prof,
and this is what we're talking about.
Could you name some of the GLCs and give us some examples of GLCs which were mismanaged by political appointees? And you claim that they have been unproductive. Is that true? I mean, we have GLCs that were productive. They still are productive. They just happen to have a little bit on the side that's channeled into party coffers, but everybody's happy. The services are being delivered. I mean, could you give us some examples of mismanagement of GLCs? Bad. Never mind 1MDB. 1MDB is by itself. Others.
Azrul, thank you for raising this point. You see, this is where the system becomes very interesting. On one hand, it can be abused to serve their vested interests. But on the other hand, they would still like to use these institutions to serve the work they were created to perform. And most politicians have found a way to achieve that balance. So, for example, Felda. Is Felda doing what it's supposed to do? Yes. Mara has got a whole list of agencies. Are they giving out a channeling support to a lot of people? Yes, they are. But did we see serious allegations of corruption involving Mara? Yes, we did. There were politicians. Anwar Musa has been charged with allegations of corruption when he was chairman of Mara. But was Mara at the same time doing things that he was supposed to do? Yes, they did. Now, this is the balance that I'm talking about that is helping simultaneously. Tabung Haji. Did Tabung Haji continue to help poor people perform the Hajj? Yes, they did, even under Najib. But did we see serious violation of corruption in Tabung Haji? Yes, we did. So this is what's happening. You can get the directorial appointments, you can get the huge stipends, but at the same time, they do appoint professionals to run these agencies to make sure they do that work too. So you could say they're having the cake and eating it. And this is what I'm saying is the system that we want to stop.
So we have some questions coming in from some of our viewers this evening, Prof. So we have a question asking between Barisan Nasional, PN is too early, but so between Barisan Nasional and Pakatan Harapan, in terms of political nominees or appointees, who's been worse? Was there any real reform undertaken by Pakatan Harapan?
You know, when Pakatan Harapan was challenging the Barisan Nasional in the last general election, Mahathir came up with some very important phrases. Cash is king. That's the first one. The second one, which he also was widely well known for, was he referred to the GLCs as a monster. So Mahathir knew how the system worked. But here's the irony. At the state level, Pakatan parties had control of Selangor, for example, and the DAP had control of Penang. Were they implementing the same system that I just talked about? Were DAP and PKR members of board of directors of GLCs? Yes, they were. Did Selangor and Penang have Chief Minister Incorporated or Menteri Besar Incorporated, a holding company similar to Minister of Finance Incorporated at the federal level? Yes, they did. Now, I thought that when Pakatan came to power, especially Mahathir, when he took over, because after all, he said it, this is a monster, cash is king, stop the system that we have created. Did he do it? He didn't. And herein is the tragedy of Pakatan. Pakatan recognized that the system was there and they had to reform it. But Pakatan also recognized one important point. Pakatan did not fare well in rural areas. The rural areas were captured by parties such as UMNO and PAS. Bersatu did very badly in rural areas. Amana did very badly in rural areas. Pakatan recognized they didn't have enough support in rural areas. But they also recognized that they have this system which directly feeds into rural areas, and if they use it well, and here I'm talking about the likes of MARA, Kerseda, Ketengah, these are all statutory bodies which go right into the rural areas. If they use the same system, and if they abuse that system, then they can also get political support at that level. Did they do that? Yes. To my mind, they did it. And we can see in terms of the Ministry of Rural Development, which had control of many of the statutory bodies, who took charge of it? A Bersatu member, Rina Harun. And why was Rina Harun given that particular ministry? I remember I said Tun Razak created the Ministry of Rural Development. It has always been controlled by senior UMNO politicians. It was given to a Bersatu member so that they could use the same system to serve their interests. So Pakatan did not change the system. And now we have a third government which is doing the same thing.
So are we then going to expect BN 2.0 with Perikatan Nasional, that the same kind of trends that we saw during the Barisan Nasional days and then carried into the Pakatan Harapan years, and then now with Perikatan Nasional, are we expecting then to see this continue perhaps indefinitely because of the kind of dynamics you've described, that we're going to be seeing more GLCs being formed to satisfy perhaps the need for more positions to give out to different appointees? Is this what we're going to see in the future?
Yes. When Ikatan took over, the irony here is this. Muhyiddin, as Prime Minister, in his first speech, when he introduced the stimulus package, he referred to a government ecosystem, which he said we need to employ to deal with this crisis, this economic crisis created by this pandemic. Recognizing the important role at which we discussed that GLCs can play in the economy, especially when we are confronted with a crisis, even he, as Prime Minister, knew that if we use the system well, we can help find mechanisms to help especially ailing companies which cannot contribute to economic growth because they're all locked down. And we can also use this to help unemployed people and the poor. Those were his statements to us. And then what did he do? He had a political crisis too to confront with. He was worried about whether he had sufficient support in his government. And then he also recognized the same government ecosystem that, as he called it, could be used to consolidate his power base.
Exactly.
And then he shifted and he began to appoint all kinds of politicians into these very same GLCs that we really need now to deal with this economic crisis. That is the tragedy. So what will politicians put first? Even at a time of crisis, they will put their political interests first. That is what we are seeing in the case of Ikatan. Now, if there's a change of government tomorrow, and they need to consolidate power, will they use the same system? That is my big fear. And that is why this program is so important. We have to stop this once and for all.
But you just described a self-sustaining cycle where in order for someone to break the wheel, so to speak, that person must be willing to lose. And nobody is going to be willing to lose, right? So to expect Pakatan Harapan to carry out its promises before is not realistic from a political aspect. And now with Perikatan Nasional, with the kind of problems that Muhyiddin is facing, it's going to be a hard sell to expect that to change anytime soon. In fact, we are seeing more of a proliferation and escalation even of this kind of culture because of the thin majority holds. So let me ask you then, is that you as a person who has done research in this, Malaysia has been one of those countries that's been able to be outstanding in the way that it's developed its economy, it's the country overall, etc. Despite the existence of this cancer which you've described. So is it possible to coexist? Because that seems to be the way that this thing is heading, you know?
You see, to answer that question, I want to make one key point. When did we see reforms really happening? At times of crisis. The first major crisis that we saw was, in fact, in the post-colonial period, the British had handed power to us. As I said, the 1960s, we begin to see the government creating all kinds of institutions to rectify the injustices of that period under colonial rule. The second major defining moment was 1969, another crisis. And then we begin to see government intervening, and we see a election coming out of the new economic policy, especially the rise of a new middle class, a new Bumiputra middle class, the reduction of poverty, all attributable to the system. I repeat this point, the system is not necessarily bad. The defining moment again was in the 1980s when Mahathir, as Prime Minister, began to make it more market-driven rather than socially driven. Now that shift from being socially driven to market driven, then we begin to see the problems emerging from being so market oriented rather than socially oriented. A key defining moment when change occurred was the 1997 currency crisis. I mentioned it earlier. When confronted with the crisis, they had no choice. They had to change it. And did a lot of good come out of it? Yes, it did. Today we don't see as much corruption among the publicly listed firms. We don't see that kind of debates among Maybank as we used to see previously, where Maybank and Bank Bumiputra used to be really always mired in corruption. So they did something with the publicly listed firms, but they didn't touch the unlisted firms and the statutory bodies. Now, today, interestingly enough, we are confronted with a very serious crisis. So it's not so simple as it's to serve our political interests, we will use it. When we are confronted with a crisis of this scale, when private firms cannot help, as I said, because they're in lockdown, they can't do anything, we turn back to the government. And the government now has to use this productively, because if they don't, there's going to be a serious economic crisis which will impact on the people. And that's when you will see the backlash against politicians.
Well, Prof, until the people experience that kind of hardship as a direct result of what you have described throughout the show, then they're not going to be able to really appreciate some of those points being made. But interestingly, if I may say, we had a minister in the Prime Minister's department, Taqiyuddin Hassan, who is also the past Secretary General, saying that since 9 of PAS's 18 MPs had not been given ministerial positions, they should be given the responsibility to manage GLCs because all of them are qualified, they're MPs. So if it is wrong, unethical, or even corrupt, and this is a question that's come from one of the viewers this evening, is wouldn't the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, MECC, or even its predecessor, Badan Pencegah Rasuah, earlier, gone after the different individuals involved in this practice if it was so wrong? I mean, if we remove the political appointees today, would there be a significant improvement in the way corporate governance is done, and most importantly, in terms of corruption levels?
Well, on the first point that you made about people and how they react, yes, people will react when there's an economic crisis, when they really feel it in their pockets, when they are out of a job, when there's no income. But unfortunately, there is another problem that we have to deal with, and that's with the racialized discourses of politicians. And politicians are very adept at using racialized discourses to camouflage the wrongdoings that they're doing in terms of this abuse of power that I've just referred to. So it's because we have to first deal with the racialized discourses, and we have not done that effectively. We are having this big problem also about how to deal with these institutions. So that's the first point I want to make. The racialized discourses are preventing us from really moving forward in terms of the changes that we need to make. Now, the second point on the MACC and why is it not acting on this, I must say there are two issues here. First, is it against the law to appoint a politician as a member of the board of directors? As I said earlier, it is not against the law. They're not breaking any law. So even if you go and make a complaint of this sort to the MACC, they'll say, what law have they broken? Yes, we do recognize that what they are doing, we don't like it. We do know what they are doing is not something these politicians should be doing, but they are not breaking any laws. And that's why Taqiyuddin could come out and say, politicians are going to be made directors of GLCs and get away with it. This is
a minister in the Prime Minister's department.
Azrul, let me say this. If you go to Kelantan, and if you look at Kelantan, Kelantan too has a minister, as a chief minister incorporated or Menteri Besar incorporated. And Kelantan has a whole slew of GLCs. Our research has already shown that. GLCs abound in Kelantan. And when we looked at the directors of these GLCs, we found a proliferation of past members as GLC directors. So when Taqiyuddin made that statement, he was just reflecting what is happening in Kelantan. And if he felt there was nothing wrong with what we are doing in Kelantan, why can't I do it at the federal level? As he said, they are entitled to it because they are elected representatives. I interpreted it to mean we are entitled to more money which we will use for our party activities, which will also be used for, as he would claim, to help poor Malays in Kelantan, which I don't know really whether that is happening. So therein lies the problem. Politicians now feel they are entitled to these positions, and they are claiming it as their own. And we are saying to them, I'm sorry, that's not the way it is. Go back to the history and look at the history. These were created as public institutions, led also by bureaucrats who were supposed to implement policies to rectify social injustices. At that time, you wouldn't have seen politicians sitting in these statutory bodies. And in the 1960s, 1970s, there was no such thing as GLCs. And the system worked very well. And they rectified many social injustices. The problem started when we began to create companies and appointed politicians there. And that's where now you see this serious wastage of very scarce resources occurring. It's the system that we have to change.
So, Prof, we're coming to the end of this evening's show, and honestly, we've barely gotten the ball really rolling down the hill, so to speak, and it seems like we're pushing it up the hill, and there's more to come, and definitely there's going to be a continuing conversation of this later on. But how I want to leave us with a positive note, and certainly it has to come out from you. How can we stop, or how can we reform what is basically a vicious cycle where the ultimate losers are going to be the Rakyat? How do we change this?
This is why I'm very proud of, I think the CSOs, the NGOs are playing a big role on this matter. We've been trying to draw attention to this. There have been studies now that are coming out. Most people were not really aware what these GLCs are all about. But the crisis today, by the government's own admission, to solve it, this pandemic has created an economic crisis. To solve it, we need to use this very GLC system. And because we now recognize the importance of this GLC system, people on the ground are also beginning to talk about it every day. If you open the newspapers every day now, you will see talk of GLCs. This was not something that we used to see in the past. Definitely not also under Pakatan. Now, because we recognize the importance of the GLCs and we recognize if they continue to be abused, we are going to be suffering. All the more now, I feel more people should put pressure on the politicians to stop this. Unfortunately, we first have to deal with the political crisis that we are now confronted with. That is stopping us from doing this. But ultimately, we have learned our lesson. The Rakyat now knows there is a GLC issue here. It has long been abused, and the time has come to change this well-entrenched political business system to make it one that is transparent and accountable to the people.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that ray of hope, and also a role and responsibility to be carried out by the rakyat themselves in ensuring that the system changes for the better. Thank you, Professor, for being our guest for this evening. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you.
that ends this evening segment discussing the role of GLC appointments in money politics in Malaysia. Please tune in to the Bahasa broadcast at the same time on Thursday night, where we continue this mind-boggling conversation. Let me wish everyone, first and foremost, since it's just the end of this weekend, Selamat Hari Raya Aidilfitri. This is Azrul Mohd Khalib signing off. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Azrul.
Thank you.